Good day. I am Lisa M. Gitigan, your presenter. Before I am going to present, allow me first to give acknowledge to my researcher, Ms. Ferosa Kimhan, and lovely Angel Capulong, my developer for this presentation. So, what is African literature? African literature consists of a body of work in different languages and various genres, ranging from oral literature to literature written in colonial languages. Types of African literature. African literature then expanded to include hymns, romance, epic, poetry, fiction narrative, epitaphes, diaries, philosophy, biography, and autobiography. One particular form of African narrative, which may have been the first to draw Western attention for the first time, was composed by slaves. Characteristics of African literature. Characteristics of African literature include slave narratives, protest against colonization, calls for independence, African pride, hope for the future, and dissent. Some of the famous African writers. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Kenyan writer who was born on January 5, 1938. His works include plays, novels, short stories, and essays. He has written everything from children's literature to social criticism. Most of his works is in English, but some of it is in Gikoyo. Next was Chinua Achebe. He was born on November 15, 1930 in Nigeria. He died on March 12, 2013. He was a novelist, a poet, a critic, and a professor. He was best known for his first novel, which is called Things Fall Apart. It was written in 1958. And lastly was Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She was born on September 15, 1977 in Nigeria. She writes poems, short stories, and novels. One of her stories, called That Harmattan Morning, was chosen as the winner of the BCC Short Story Awards. She also won the O. Henry Prize for a story called The American Embassy. Here are the examples of their literary works. And to understand more about African literature, I prepared a short video clip introducing the literature of Africans.
What does it mean to be human? What are the common experiences of all people? These may be large questions, so let's be more specific. What does it mean to be European? Any answer to this question would have to ignore specifics for each country. A similar problem arises when trying to define African literature. There are 54 nations which make up Africa. Each of these separate countries have their own history, culture, tribes, and traditions. That being said, there are some commonalities shared by literature which comes from the continent as a whole. Defining African literature can be complicated. There are some authors who believe African literature can only be composed in African languages. Others believe African literature can be composed in any language so long as it is composed by authors from Africa. In this vlog, we'll narrow our focus to the broader history and characteristics of African literature in general. African literature has origins dating back thousands of years to ancient Egypt's hieroglyphs, or writing which uses pictures to represent words. These ancient Egyptian beginnings led to the Arabic poetry, which spread during the Arabic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE and through Western Africa in the 9th century CE. These African and Arabic cultures continued to blend with the European culture and literature to form a unique literary form. Africa experienced several hardships in its long history, which left an impact on the themes of its literature. One hardship which led to many others is that of colonization. Colonization is when people leave their country and settle in another land, often one which is already inhabited. The problem with colonization is when the incoming people exploit the indigenous people and the resources of the inhabited land. Colonization led to slavery. Millions of African people were enslaved and brought to Western countries around the world from the 16th to the 19th centuries. This spreading of African people, largely against their will, is called the African diaspora. Sub-Saharan Africa developed a written literature during the 19th and early 20th centuries. This development came as a result of missionaries coming to the area. The missionaries came to Africa to build churches and language schools in order to translate religious texts. This led to Africans writing in both European and indigenous languages. Though African literature's history is as long as it's rich, most of the popular works have come out since 1950s, especially the noteworthy Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Looking beyond the most recent works is necessary to understand the complete development of this collection of literature. Now let's take a look at some of the characteristics of African literature. Literature from Africa has many characteristics. We will highlight some of the most prevalent characteristics here. To begin, let's look at African literature's broad scope of production. This literature has been composed in English for Western and African audiences. It is also composed in African languages for African readers. This literature comes from all parts of Africa, both Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan. From this general perspective, let's shift to the several forms of expressions which African literature has. This literature, like many others, has its roots in the oral tradition, or sharing stories, advice, and history through talking and presenting. Early African writing tends to tell folk tales or stories and legends passed down through a culture. These folk tales are meant to provide guidance and pass on cultural history. These stories are for all members of the community, but especially for the children. African writers began to express themselves in newspapers to spread their views. African literature then expanded to include hymns, romance, epic, poetry, fictional narrative, epistles, diaries, philosophy, biography, and autobiography. One particular form of African narrative, which may have been the first to draw Western attention for the first time, was composed by slaves. An example of the slave narrative is the interesting narrative of the life and adventures of Luada Equiano, or Gustavo Vasa, the African, published in 1789. This narrative gave a vivid and horrifying image of the slave trade. Though it took many forms of expression, themes of protest began to guide 20th century African literature. The focus has been dominated by writing which decries colonization and calls for independence. Such writers as Osman Sembène, Wole Soyinka, and Chinua Achebe famously wrote during this time. They captured and communicated the general feeling of African pride in their past and the hope for the future.
So good day, ma'am. I just want to ask a question. So this is my question. What is the concept of African literature?
So, the concept of African literature, the body of traditional oral and written literature and Afro-Asiatic and African languages, together with works written by Africans and European languages.
Hi, I'm Edward, and I am here to raise questions for the participants. So, the question is, what is the importance of African literature?
Importance of African literature. African literature is not important only because of its relevant setting and relatable storylines. It is also increase our social consciousness and raises awareness of social, political, and economic crises that the African continent is facing.
Good performance, very informative, and congratulations to the job well done.